Chang in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, GDPR goes into effect this Friday, changing forever how tech companies handle personal data. How will it affect you, and what's the likelihood it will be implemented in the United States? Plus, a 60 Minutes report devoted to Google's extensive search capabilities hammered home the notion of Alphabet's dominance. Now, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin is urging the Justice Department to review the power big tech has over the economy. And the Viva Tech Conference kicks off this week in Paris. Can French President Emmanuel Macron transform France into a global innovation and tech hub? But first, to our top story. It is perhaps the first truly massive set of laws for the digital age, and it's going to affect in Europe starting Friday. It's called GDPR, as we've been discussing, the General Data Protection Regulation, and it is meant to safeguard the data of European Union citizens. And any company found violating the rules in line for unprecedented fines ranging from $24 million to 4% of total revenue. Whichever is greater. That means a company like Facebook could be on the hook for $1.6 billion if it is found in violation. We're going to go to London to see if these new laws will truly test that saying that Silicon Valley innovates while the EU regulates. We're joined by Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde, as well as our Bloomberg opinion columnist, Alex Webb. So, Alex, I want to start with you. Fortune 500 companies are spending almost $8 billion to become compliant. What exactly are they doing?
It's firstly about creating new terms and conditions that users inside or residents of the European Union have to agree to in order to ensure that the companies are compliant. And, you know, everybody in the European Union will have had alerts constantly from Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat over the past few weeks asking every time they log into the app, please agree to these new terms and conditions. And the thing about them is the classic T's and C's, you know, it's a huge list of impenetrable legalese. These have to be comprehensible. And it means that there are perhaps a few massaging of really the way they use their data, but it's a huge legal challenge for these companies.
So, Caroline, if I'm a Facebook user, how does this change how Facebook handles my data?
It might not change the way in which it handles your data, but it will certainly make it more transparent about the way it uses your data. It has to really explicitly say what they're using it for. Notably, I could say that I will no longer wanted my data on Facebook. You have the so-called right to be forgotten, as it's known, so they'd have to take down your data. But it really is about just making it clear, digestible about what it is that your data is now used for. I think it's fascinating that not only is this, though, affecting the big tech companies such as Facebook and Google, and yeah, Wells Fargo says it might hurt their revenue to the tune of the low single-digit percentage points. But what it will really hurt is also your general mum and pop shops who happen to be taking your data to a certain extent. Maybe they've got an email list of you. Maybe the hairdresser has your email. Maybe any local business that has data on you now has to get an explicit consent to use it going forward. That's why we're being inundated with hundreds of emails asking us to keep in touch.
Now, Mark Zuckerberg, when he was testifying before U.S. lawmakers in Washington, D.C., said he's committed to rolling out GDPR globally, even though that's not required. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We're committed to rolling out the controls and the affirmative consent and the special controls around sensitive types of technology like face recognition that are required in GDPR. We're doing that around the world. So I think it's certainly worth discussing whether we should have something similar in the U.S. But what I would like to say today is that we're going to go forward and implement that regardless of what the regulatory outcome is.
Alex, what do we know as the likelihood in terms of whether U.S. lawmakers will enforce the same thing that the Europeans have adopted?
Well, I think, first of all, to backtrack ever so slightly, if you listen to actually what Mark Zuckerberg said about rolling out GDPR globally, they're not. They're doing some pieces of GDPR globally with a few changes depending on different geographies. Of course, there might be some elements of GDPR which contravene laws in other geographies. So it's not a case of a one-stop shop where you just roll out everything exactly the same. But yes, in the US, there will be some sort of regulation. It seems there is a growing consensus on both sides of the aisle that, yes, they need some sort of regulation. Now, crucially, there will be long conversations with Silicon Valley itself as to the nature of this regulation. And I would not be surprised if it's nowhere near as broad and swinging as GDPR is here in the European Union.
Now, Caroline, we know Mark Zuckerberg is now set to testify in Europe this week. How do we expect this to unfold differently to what we saw in the United States, given the increased focus there on privacy?
I think tougher questions. We know that the CTO, when he came to the United Kingdom, suffered much tougher questions, more informed questions than perhaps was the case in the United States, because the way in which they managed to give the questioning isn't just different in its lineup. The US senators had, 4 minutes per pop, whereas they had longer time to really drill down into the specifics in the United Kingdom. The EU, we know that they're fighting to have this in public rather than behind closed doors, as was initially agreed. So we'll have to see how much they dig into it, but they will want to be hammering home their desire to bring these sorts of big companies to task. I mean, when you look at what GDPR stands for, it really does stand for the consumer being given the power to opt in rather than having to opt out necessarily. I mean, to bring it home to viewers, this is a 56,000-word law that is being brought into consideration here in Europe. It's the length of, get this, Shakespeare's Hamlet and Othello combined. They want them to be thought that they are tough on big tech, particularly when it comes to these sort of deemed monopolies or oligopolies that are Facebook and Google. The sad fact of the matter is I think laws like this will affect the smaller businesses. It costs more for them than it does the juggernauts such as Facebook and Google. But I think Mark Zuckerberg will be given a tough task when it comes to the EU to face the MEPs in Brussels.
All right. Well, we, of course, are going to be covering Mark Zuckerberg's remarks in Europe. Bloomberg's Caroline Hine, as well as Alex Webb. Thank you both so much for joining us. Now, a story we are watching. Google could face $4.3 billion in damages in a British lawsuit involving iPhone users. This according to a company court filing. iPhone users sued Google, claiming it unlawfully collected personal data by bypassing the iPhone's default privacy settings. Google denies the claims. And sticking with Google, the company was hit hard on 60 Minutes this weekend. Charges of Google's illegal search tactics getting the primetime TV treatment. How the U.S. government is now responding to the so-called monopoly next. And later, Tesla also getting hit. Why Consumer Reports magazine will not give Tesla's Model 3 its recommendation. This is Bloomberg. Google is getting a lot of heat after a 60 Minutes segment devoted to claims the search engine wields a destructive monopoly in online search and search advertising. The CBS segment highlighted how critics and rivals like Yelp have had enough of the company's dominance. Here is part of this weekend's discussion with Yelp CEO Jeremy Stoppelman.
Ultimately, that manifested itself in you expecting that the top links, the things that it shows at the top of that page, are the best from around the web, the best that the world has to offer. And I can tell you that is not the case. That is not the case anymore.
Since the program aired, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin urged the Justice Department to review the power that large tech firms like Google have over the U.S. economy, taking a page right out of the EU's playbook. Margaret Vestager, the EU Competition Commissioner, also appeared on 60 Minutes saying she is intent on stopping Google's illegal behavior in search. Joining us now from Stanford, California, Gary Reback, antitrust lawyer at Carr and Farrell, who was featured in Sunday night's episode of 60 Minutes and has pursued antitrust cases against Google and Microsoft. Also in New York, we have Brian White, analyst at Monness, Crespi & Hart, who currently has a buy rating on the company. So, Gary, I want to start with you. Let's take some historical comparisons here, like Standard Oil, which was broken up. What are the arguments for Google and Alphabet that they have gotten too big?
Well, the basic argument is that they have no real rivals in general search, and they are using their power in general search to manipulate search results in ways that disadvantage competitors and limit consumers' choices.
Brian, fair?
Well, I think, they definitely have a very high market share, so about 90% of the U.S. search market. I think as big companies get bigger and bigger, it's tougher to come by growth. And sometimes big companies engage in tactics that maybe they shouldn't. So, I watched the program. I thought it was a great program. I thought great points were made. I don't think there was a smoking gun, but, I think it provides, ample information for people to look into it a little more.
So Yelp CEO Jeremy Stoppelman said on 60 Minutes that he couldn't have started Yelp if Google operated the way it operates today, and talked about the threat to his business. He also said this about just how links are displayed and how that affects you as a perhaps smaller business. Take a listen.
It's not even just the first page. It's the first few links on the page is the vast majority of where user attention goes and where the traffic flows.
So if you're not at the top of the page or the bottom of the first page or on the second page, that's going to affect your business.
Yeah, if you're on the second page, forget it. You're not a real business.
Now, here's what Google told 60 Minutes. The company denied it was a monopoly in search or search advertising, citing competitors like Amazon and Facebook. It says it does not make changes to its algorithm to disadvantage competitors, and that our responsibility is to deliver the best results possible to our users, not specific placements for sites within our results. We understand that those sites whose ranking falls will be unhappy and may complain publicly. Gary, what about the argument that some of these sites may just not like how they're displayed in Google, which may be directly correlated to the strength of their business and what they have to offer?
That argument is totally bogus, and you don't have to take my word for it. If you look at the Federal Trade Commission report that 60 Minutes cited, that's been up on the Wall Street Journal website for 2 years now, you'll see in the footnotes that the FTC got Google's internal emails, and they showed that Google specifically made a list of competitors to target with the goal of bringing those competitors down 20% in their search traffic hits, and they changed their algorithm repeatedly to get that result. And then they reported back to their superiors that they had, in fact, achieved their result. So I don't understand how these Google people with a straight face can go on saying what they're saying. It is directly belied by the FTC report.
You say that the government isn't enforcing the laws that we have. Do you also believe we need new laws or lawmakers who better understand the power of technology?
Well, we could certainly use more lawmakers who might get interested in this sector and understand how it affects their constituents. But I don't think we need to go off on the long rigmarole of trying to pass new legislation. We have legislation that worked fine against Microsoft. It just has to be enforced. The problem right now is it's not being enforced, or at least it wasn't in the Obama administration. It needs to be enforced now. If that doesn't work, we can try something else, but I think that will work. It worked against Microsoft.
Now, Brian, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin was asked about this report. He didn't call out Google specifically, but said that, tech companies in general, the DOJ needs to take a closer look. Does that concern you for Alphabet shareholders?
Well, it doesn't. I think when you look at Google and you look at all the businesses that they're in, if something ever came down antitrust-wise and say they had to break up the company, it would probably be worth a lot more. Right? I mean, they're number one in the smartphone operating system market by sure. They've got a great Waymo driverless car. They're number one in search. There's a lot of different YouTube, 1.8 billion monthly subs. They've got a lot of great businesses, under this umbrella. And so, sure, you should always look at any big company that's abusing their power. And so I think that's a given.
In interesting, Gary, that if Google was broken up, there's an argument to be made it could be worth a lot more, and that these companies separately could be even more powerful. You know, how do you respond to that? I mean, and if Google is broken up, how should it be?
Well, first of all, I think that there's a good chance these individual constituent parts would be worth more. I mean, historically, we know that when Standard Oil was broken up, that's when John D. Rockefeller got most of his net worth. But the fact that they're worth more individually does not mean they're more powerful. You see, they can't conspire with each other as separate individual companies. In many cases, they would have to compete. At the very least, they would have to enter into contract negotiations, and other people would be able to compete against them more readily. So I agree with the other commentator. There is a good possibility they could be worth more to shareholders individually, and I think that's something that we ought to think about down the line. But the first step is to have a public trial so we understand what the remedy should be. We can't just jump to breaking them up. We don't know how to break them up exactly. We need a public trial so we understand what the issues are.
Now, interestingly, Facebook has been the company that's been in the regulatory spotlight over the last few weeks, though Google spends far more on lobbying in Washington than Facebook or Apple. We actually pulled the numbers on that. I'm curious, Gary, how do you think Google compares to Facebook when it comes to the idea of being a monopoly, given that Facebook also owns WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook Messenger? Is Google so much bigger an offender?
Well, I think that Google has been an offender longer. I try to be careful about my comments on companies, and I've spent a long time studying Google. 9 years. But I haven't gotten those kind of complaints yet about Facebook, so I want to be more circumspect in terms of what I say. I don't think the right approach is to try to compare one to the other. Rather, we evaluate each one against the legal standard. Right now, there's a complete record in Europe. There is a record developed by the FTC in the United States, all with respect to Google's antitrust behavior. We ought to move on that record. That's the next thing that needs to happen.
So, Gary, last question. You actually pursued the case against Google in the EU. The company was fined $2.7 billion. Google is appealing that decision. How do you expect this to play out?
Well, I would expect in Europe, this is a decision by the European Commission, and I would expect that the courts will uphold the European Commission, not only because their record is good and their investigation was thorough, but because the courts there always uphold the European Commission. So Google's going to lose that money. But whether that one investigation and decision by itself will curb Google's behavior, I'm not sure that's the case. The EU is going to have to do a lot more if they want to bring Google to heel.
Brian, do you think that any of this will substantially change Google's business? Obviously, you're still recommending the stock. What could change that?
You know, I don't think in the near term, but I think all of these are great data points to think about, longer term, how Google needs to change. I think a lot of these big tech companies in some way need to change a little bit because as you get bigger, like I said, it's tougher to grow. And maybe there are some people doing things they shouldn't. And that's something, the top executives should take a look at.
All right, Brian White, Moniz Crespi and Hart, Gary Reebok, Karin Farrell, antitrust lawyer. Thank you both. Obviously, we're going to continue to watch this. Coming up, one of the most influential sources on information for U.S. car shoppers passes on rating Tesla's Model 3. Details behind Consumer Reports' latest grade or lack thereof. Next, this is Bloomberg. Consumer Reports has passed on rating Tesla's Model 3. The magazine will not recommend the car for various reasons, including long stopping distance. The Model 3 took 7 feet longer to stop than Ford's full-size F-150 pickup truck. The magazine also cited the car's hard-to-use controls, but praised Tesla's battery range and handling. Joining us now for more, Bloomberg's Dana Hull, who covers Tesla for us. So what exactly is Consumer Reports concerned about here?
Well, they have a number of concerns, but the main one is this braking test. I mean, they tested the Model 3 in a variety of conditions. They tested more than one vehicle, and it just took a lot longer to stop than a full-size pickup truck. So that's a big concern. I mean, you need to have great braking system, and the Consumer Reports does a very thorough job. So a recommendation from them is kind of coveted in the auto industry. They had a lot of praise for the Model S. The fact that they passed on the Model 3 is a big deal.
Did they have anything to say about autopilot and the safety concerns?
They did not talk about autopilot. They really talked about the braking as their main concern, as well as just wind noise and comfort in the back seat when you're in the car itself.
How common is this for Consumer Reports to pass on rating a very popular car?
It's unusual. I mean, particularly because they have a long history of being very, very positive on Tesla, particularly with the S. And so, you know, sometimes their ratings can change. Obviously, Tesla has the ability to upgrade their cars through over-the-air software updates, but to just pass on the 3 this early on is pretty unusual.
Any response from Tesla?
Not yet. I mean, Tesla said that they did their own braking tests and found differences, but they haven't responded to the report in full.
So talk to us about the production issues and what we know about the $35,000 version of the Model 3.
Right. So when Elon Musk first unveiled the Model 3 in March of 2016, he said it costs $35,000 before options or incentives. But when it comes to production, they're actually producing the higher end versions of the car first, and no one has seen the $35,000 version yet. And so people that ordered the car really hoping that it was going to be that cheap are still waiting.
Even employees and even the first
first
in line are not getting this car.
They have not made the $35,000 smaller range battery car yet.
So does this have to do with the production issues that the company has been grappling with?
Well, I think Tesla will make more money if they sell the higher end cars first, and there's demand sort of across the spectrum. But I think, you know, the sort of whole thesis around the car was that this was mass market, and they're not really selling it at that mass market price point yet. Over the weekend, Elon was tweeting about how the all-wheel drive version is now available, and if you fully option it, it's $78,000. So that's a pretty big delta from the $35,000 base model.
So what is the latest that we know about whether these production issues are under control, given the executive turnover, given the shareholder battles? Lots going on.
I mean, it seems like they're working through them. I mean, Elon is sort of putting forth a great face about how happy he is with the production bottlenecks. He said something about how they're having a hackathon and working on all the robots. We won't really know until early July when Tesla releases its second quarter sales and production figures.
All right, Dana Hull covers Tesla for us. Thank you so much for that update. Coming up, getting ready to be GDPR compliant, just how companies can get in line or face massive fines. Later, we will take a comprehensive look at the state of the electric vehicle market and why a new report says China will hold the top spot for the EV market for decades to come. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Back to our top story, the anticipated arrival this week of Europe's new data privacy laws called GDPR. Just how will these new laws affect consumers around the world? Bloomberg's Quick Take has the answers.
You may have seen a few of these pop up on your phone or in your email. Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Square, GoDaddy, Tesco, Sainsbury's, H&M, and many more are updating their policies to give consumers more control over their personal data. Those updates and changes are thanks to a new law governing data privacy called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. The catch is, GDPR only applies to people who live in the European Union. But its adoption is largely expected to have Americans asking, why don't we have that? Here's how data collection currently works. When you sign up for, let's say, Facebook, you have to click a box agreeing to the company's terms. Those terms give Facebook the right to track your online activities, even if you're not actively browsing Facebook. Facebook can let third parties access it in order to sell ads and services.
Consumers will have the right to ask for copies of anything as basic as messages sent to them or by them.
That's Bloomberg tech editor Nate Langson.
Up to entire archives of all the content they've generated on a service.
On May 25th, companies with more than 250 employees and that hold data on European citizens will have to get unambiguous consent from users to collect their data, instead of just burying that okay inside fine print. It will also make it much easier to revoke consent users had previously given. For consumers that do opt in, they have a right to know what's being done with their data, and instead of being charged to obtain it, can request a free copy.
For companies like Google and Facebook, they've been making data available for download and deletion upon request for quite some time.
Consumers also have the right to be forgotten, which lets citizens request that organizations delete their data. Data portability. That gives consumers the right to retrieve their data and sell it to other companies. So, for example, you may be able to trade something like a gift certificate from Zara in exchange for your shopping history from J.Crew. If a firm has a data breach, companies must notify the authorities within 72 hours, and any failure to comply with this new law will be costly. Penalty fines can be as high as 4% of a company's global annual revenue.
Europe expects companies to act within the spirit of the law and not just to try and follow it to the letter. This means there'll be disputes and legal precedents to be set over the coming years.
So while the US is still reeling over Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the EU is moving ahead with tough new rules. Many will ask if the US should be next.
Now let's turn to someone who is helping corporations big and small get themselves in GDPR compliance. Doug McPherson is the General Counsel and Chief Administrative Officer for OpenX, an independent ad exchange for publishers. OpenX was in compliance with GDPR as early as January and has set up online resources for companies in need of guidance. Doug McPherson joins us now from LA. So, Doug, what do you think the most challenging part of the process is that companies need to know about?
Well, thanks, Emily. OpenX operates one of the world's largest advertising exchanges, connecting global brands with thousands of media companies, websites, and mobile applications. And that question is on all of our partners' minds right now. As your explainer noted, GDPR really forces companies to change the paradigm in the way they think about data. Right now, I think a lot of companies have taken for granted the data that they can collect from users and then use for purposes that might in some cases be unrelated to the purpose for which it was originally collected. Now, GDPR puts in place this new paradigm called privacy by design. And that has a number of elements underneath it that US companies need to take seriously.
Right. So as companies go through this, what are the biggest pain points, would you say, now that you have done it?
Yes, so I think taking user rights seriously and making sure that the disclosures to users meet not just the letter and but fully letter and spirit of the law, that's going to be paramount to full GDPR compliance. And the regulators have been very clear that they want to make sure that those notices that users get are explicit and granular. And I think one of the concerns the regulators have is that, especially in the EU, people are used to receiving these cookie banners and just clicking through them. And there is a concern that users might not take full advantage of all the information that's being made available to them. So consent is one big topic. I think data security is another one. Now, that happens in the background, but the data notification rules under GDPR, the 72-hour notice, that's going to require companies to have very strict monitoring measures in place so that they can detect any breach if it occurs. And simply complying with the new data subject access requests, that is going to require companies to put in place new policies and procedures as well.
Now, there have been reports that some companies, smaller companies, have shut down ahead of this. I mean, are there companies that just aren't going to be able to get it together?
Yes, well, I spent last week with 40 leading media companies, and some of them have reached that conclusion. And I think this is one of the unintended consequences of GDPR, that while it is well-intentioned, one of the consequences could be that EU users are deprived of valuable content because some companies are going to make the decision that the potential fines and the penalties are just too great to risk any potential violation of GDPR. And if that happens in any large numbers, that's really going to be a loss for the breadth and diversity of content that's available to EU users.
So can you give us any examples of a business that said, look, this is just too much of a risk? We need to cease operations, or maybe we do need to cease operations.
Yeah, I don't know that I can speak to any specific companies, but I think that the majority view is, look, a lot of standards are just being set here, and this is evolving very quickly. We do want to be able to provide our content to EU users, but we want to make sure that we're absolutely sure that we're doing that in a fully compliant way that respects user rights. So my hope is that a lot of these publishers and websites are going to make their content available, but it's only going to be after they've done all of their work to make sure that they can do it in a safe way.
And what is your estimation of the likelihood that similar rules will be put in place in the United States? And what impact, if that does happen, what impact would that have?
Right. Well, there are efforts afoot right now. Last month, Senators Markey and Blumenthal introduced a bill called the Consent Act, coincidentally, I think on the same day that Mark Zuckerberg was testifying to Congress. And that would require the FTC to put in place policies and procedures that in some ways mimic what GDPR has done. The other thing that's happening is individual states are taking action and looking at legislation that would take effect in their states, which, just as we've seen with the GDPR in the EU, while it's targeted to EU residents, any company that processes data related to those EU residents, wherever they're located, is subject to GDPR. So, a single state taking action could have broad industry implications.
So, net, do you think consumers will be better served as a result of GDPR? Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
Well, the costs are significant, and there's no doubt that companies are taking this seriously. Ernst & Young put out one study that said that Fortune 500 companies are spending $7.8 billion on GDPR compliance. And companies are hiring scores of new data privacy professionals. So put that up with software programmers as the hardest role to fill these days, at least in the tech industry. So the costs are significant. The benefits are unknown. I mean, remember, this is a global regulation that is paradigm shifting. Nothing like this has ever happened. And what we're really going to have to see is whether users take advantage of the controls that they have, or whether they are eager to get to the content and they click through those consent boxes without taking full advantage and making all the choices that they now have available to them.
All right, Doug McPherson, General Counsel for OpenX, thank you so much for breaking it down. Coming up, going electric. A new Bloomberg report forecasts Tesla will encounter steep competition from other automakers as spending for EVs ramps up. We will discuss next. And later, French President Emmanuel Macron is attempting to usher in a new era of innovation and growth for the tech industry in France. We'll discuss his successes and setbacks. Coming up, this is Bloomberg. The next few years are expected to usher in a tectonic shift to the auto industry, and electric vehicles are on track to change the future of transportation. A new report from Bloomberg New Energy Finance predicts by 2040, 55% of all new car sales will be electric. Here now with more on the report, we're joined by Salim Morsi in New York. So Salim, first of all, let's set the global stage, because your report focuses a lot on how China will actually dominate this market. How so?
Well, there's two main reasons. First of all, China is the largest auto market in the world, with over 23 million cars sold a year, and the second biggest is the US. So in terms of absolute size, China is already the biggest. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, are the policies that are driving auto companies to produce and sell these electric cars. So we expect both on the sheer size of the market and the policy framework that is driving electrification is going to be the strongest in China.
So knowing that, how should other countries be responding and watching?
Well, China is not alone in doing this. So, I mean, yes, China was about half of the total EV sales last year globally, with about 500,000 cars sold. And to put that into context, it's about 90 million cars are sold globally. So we're still talking about a very small market. But the US and Europe also have a set of quite aggressive policies, albeit not as strong as what is going on in China. But in the US, you have things like the CAFE standards and the ZEV mandates in California. Similarly, in Europe, you have stringent CO2 emissions requirements. So the trend is similar in all these markets, but the strongest for sure is in China.
So which companies, which tech companies and car companies do you think are best poised to take advantage of this, and why?
Well, so we hear, we hear Tesla being mentioned in the news almost on a daily, I would say almost hourly basis, but they only constitute about 10% of all electric vehicle sales globally. The leading global EV sales manufacturers are companies most people have never heard of, companies like BAIC, BYD, and a lot of other Chinese companies. So while Tesla has perhaps created the movement of electrification in the last 10 years, they should be cautious of not to be caught in the stampede as these incumbent OEMs like Volkswagen, BMW release a large number of EV models over the coming years. And what we do is count them, and by 2020 we're going to see about 300 EV models available for sale globally.
Now, there's been frustration that the electrification of cars hasn't happened as fast as some might have expected. Same with the automation of cars. What do you think is going to be more impactful in the near term? Will it be self-driving cars, or will it be electrification? So
to us, electrification is by far the most impactful trend we're seeing in the automotive sector. Obviously, autonomous cars are a point of interest to many investors and industry observers, but the feedback we get out of those who are actually building this technology is that it's about 10 or 15 years away. So for the time being, the biggest changes we expect to see in the car market and the passenger vehicle market will be around the powertrains, the energy that drives these vehicles. Automation for sure will have a big impact, but it's a little bit more pushed back into the future, and frankly less known as to when it comes to bear.
So all of these trends combined, along with the rise of ride-sharing, how will this impact consumers? What will consumers be buying or not buying as a result?
Well, we're seeing a modal shift essentially. So when Detroit companies that were B2 or selling hardware to customers have now to think about whether or not they're in the business of selling mobility, and should mobility be in the form of selling or leasing a car to a private citizen, or is it in the form of the Ubers and Lyfts of this world? What's happening now is that these companies are hedging their bets. So you've seen companies like GM take large equity stakes in Lyft and launch other initiatives like Chariot at Ford. So I think it's still very much up in the air. You've seen the kind of setback that companies like Uber and now Tesla are facing with their hardware technology, not being up to par. So I think from the incumbents in the market, they're taking a very cautious approach. But again, for the short to medium term, it's very much the paradigm of passenger cars sold to private consumers. What is changing, we think, is the electrification part.
All right, Salim Morsi of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, thank you so much for that report. Coming up, Station F in Paris, the world's biggest startup accelerator, is changing the game for tech across the country. What you need to know about France's startup scene next. This is Bloomberg. A story we are watching: Netflix has nabbed another high-profile partnership. Former U.S. President and First Lady Barack and Michelle Obama have signed a multi-year deal with the streaming giant to create a diverse mix of programs. It may include scripted series, documentaries, or even feature films. In the wake of Brexit and President Trump's complicated relationship with Silicon Valley, tech firms are expanding their presence in Paris. Google and Facebook are among those making large investments in France and luring tech talent to the region. As the Viva Tech Summit kicks off this week in Paris, Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde explores how President Emmanuel Macron is ushering in a new era of innovation there.
French President Emmanuel Macron is looking to become the go-to head of state for global tech. This week, he's hosting the heads of Google, Microsoft, Uber, and other notable firms at the presidential palace. The meetings will be followed by the Viva Technology Summit. This could signal a big shift for the country. For years, the French tech scene has operated in the shadow of the rest of the world, but Macron's capitalizing on a void left by President Trump's, well, complicated relationship with global tech. France has had only 3 startups achieve unicorn status, compared to 22 in the UK and 105 in the US. But recently, Paris's tech industry is reinventing itself. There were a record 743 tech deals in 2017, growing by almost 45% from 2016. And the total value of the deals also jumped nearly 50% from last year. Meanwhile, the country is hoping to jumpstart innovation and investment with its biggest bet to date, Station F in Paris's 13 arrondissement. It's the world's largest startup incubator. The 366,000 square foot property opened up last summer with 8 event spaces, 4 kitchens, and 1 coffee shop and a pop-up space. However, it will cost you. Firms like Accel Partners and Index Ventures pay $6,100 a year membership fee. So, has it been a success? It remains to be seen. But Station F is continuing to expand the programs it offers and the campus. It will soon open 100 shared apartments.
Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde there, who joins us now. And Caroline, you are going to be in Paris this week, where there are a couple of different tech conferences, including Viva Tech and Bloomberg Sooner Than You Think, as well as this big meeting with a number of different tech leaders and French President Emmanuel Macron. What do we know about this meeting? Who's going to be there? What are they going to talk about?
There's going to be about 40 leaders gathering to meet Emmanuel Macron in the Élysée Palace. It's going to be a gathering of the great and the good. There's going to be Ginny Rometty going there. We know the Uber CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, he's been invited, CEO Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And really, a plethora of the key leaders, Satya Nadella comes to mind. They're all going to talk about how technology can be for good. I mean, the timing is pretty perfect for Emmanuel Macron at the moment. The president really shining a light on the responsibilities that these technology companies, we understand, according to people familiar with the matter and some of his aides, that, look, he, of course, wants to lure investment to France from some of these big technology companies, but he wants to speak to the likes of Eric Schmidt, he wants to speak to the likes of Dara Khosrowshahi about the responsibility of juggernaut tech companies that he thinks, look, they're like countries, and they need to start to face up to those responsibilities, whether it be in robotics, whether it's in artificial intelligence, whether it's in, notably, privacy. He's going to have one-on-one meetings with a lot of these key speakers. And interestingly enough, he's going to be speaking one-on-one with Mark Zuckerberg about that very thing, about privacy. And this is the first leader of a developed nation that Mark Zuckerberg's going to be meeting since the scandal involving Cambridge Analytica.
It's, of course, on the back of his testimony. Caroline, what is the argument do you think that President Macron will be making to these tech leaders about why they should, build up their presence in France versus elsewhere?
This is fascinating because, of course, Emmanuel Macron is known as particularly young. He's only 40 years old, dynamic. He was an ex-investment banker, but he was an ex-entrepreneur himself. He tried to found an education-related startup, and he wants to show that France is changing. France is known as having terrible labour laws in terms of very hard to hire and fire in France. You pay money up front before you've even hired anyone in terms of employee taxes. So he's trying to change the narrative of France, saying we are a place that you don't have to leave because they have fantastic mathematics and science, engineering focused schools and universities, but they lose all their tech talent, notably to Silicon Valley. I think one of the highest presence of foreign tech talent in Silicon Valley is from France. I think it's noted that some 60,000 people are there from France. So he's trying to say, don't go away to build your businesses, build them here, be entrepreneurial. You have Station F to build up the new dynamic businesses, but also come here and invest. They've lured Cisco in the previous years. They've launched a big AI focus, artificial intelligence, getting Samsung to invest, getting the likes of DeepMind, part of Google, to invest. And really, they're investing along with them. There's a big fund, a 10 billion euro fund that they're managing. And part of that is going to AI, some 1.5 billion euros going towards artificial intelligence. So he's really trying to change the narrative that this is a good place to live, to work, to build businesses, and to invest in.
Give us an idea of who you're going to be speaking to this week and what is on your agenda.
Yeah, I think this is going to be great because we've got our own Bloomberg event, as you called it. It was sooner than you think that we're going to be doing in tandem on Wednesday is when all the tech leaders come into Paris and meet with Emmanuel Macron. But we're going to be talking to some of the key leaders out there, whether they be, as you can see, Carlos Ghosn, who leads Renault. We're going to be talking about the new mobility technology that they're focusing on. Will Xu, who is known for Deliveroo, that is the fastest growing startup in Europe. It's, of course, delivering your rather higher end restaurant food around the UK. And they're just looking at France. We've also got Frederic Mazzella, BlaBlaCar CEO, one of the only billion-dollar valuation companies in France. They were born in 2006, speaking to that particular leader of that business, but we're also speaking to a whole host of VCs. You're going to have Balderton there. You're going to have Atomico, the key leader there. Nicholas Zenstrom's going to be taking to the stage for Firesides. We're going to be speaking to the leader of businesses based out in San Francisco, like Stripe. We're going to be really across the board at Sooner Than You Think, speaking to business leaders. And then also then going to Viva Technology, where we're going to be speaking to another whole host of key leaders, like the local business leader for Uber, the leader of the European part of the business there on the very next day on May the 24th. So 2 key days of focus, whether it be at our own event, at the Viva Technology event, and also shining a light on just what the tech leaders are discussing with none other than Emmanuel Macron, the president, as well.
Okay, Caroline Hyde, we will be watching you this week. Thank you so much. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. On tomorrow's show, we're also going to be talking about the ongoing popularity of esports and how the game Fortnite has taken over the globe with Judd Hennigan, Allied Esports CEO. That is all for now. This is Bloomberg.